how it all went south.
So yeah, today's story is going to be about a cadaver dog owner who faked what she was doing with her dog. It's pretty surprising and shocking, and this was a very well-known handler of a cadaver dog, and she had investigated, over 1,000 cases. She said all over the country. So there's huge implications here. But I wanted to step back and first just talk a little bit about a little bit of our experience with cadaver dogs. I mean, you remember that.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, when we did it, it was making In the Red Clay. And if you guys haven't heard In the Red Clay, that was the first podcast series that I did. Jason produced that. And what a story that turned out to be. But yeah, we ended up in the middle of August in Georgia. It was like one of the hotter years in recent years, and we're out here with cadaver dogs, and
I mean, we're like driving through rough terrain on this guy's property next to the Mulberry River, and there's, I mean, there could have been snakes everywhere, and there
were,
yes,
and bees
and kudzu and poison ivy. Like we were,
and 100 degrees and 95% humidity. I mean, it was really terrifying in that regard.
Yeah, and so you hooked up with Tracy Sargent, who is his incredible reputation as a handler of cadaver dogs, and she's been on the case with many of these discoveries, and she's incredible first and foremost. Like she's real
awesome.
deal, and she will drive from anywhere to help you, right? Like she's incredible, and to see these dogs get out of her big old Suburban, I think it was. And just they're different dogs. They have different instincts, and the communication between Tracy as the handler and these dogs is really incredible. It's like nothing I've ever seen.
Yeah, that was the coolest experience. I mean, and the way she reads the body language of the dogs. I mean, they know these commands and things, and they're just so well trained. But it really, and she was explaining that to us, I remember. But I mean, it's just to watch her read the slightest movement these dogs make, and it means something to her, was so awesome. It really was.
What was so crazy, and she acknowledged this, which is, I mean, listen, those dogs marked scents immediately almost. I mean, she's like, this doesn't happen. Usually they get a little bit unsettled. It takes them a while to get used to their surroundings. This is a new place for them. I'm telling you, I remember like those, especially that last time we were out there, and I think it had rained and it was muddy.
Mm-hmm.
Those dogs were on it, and we thought, wow, and
and very well, we never
got the backhoe out immediately, right?
At the one location, just because it was on property owned by like an investment company. So and they were not gonna, but it was weird. We had police out there and everything, and it's a whole operation, and that's a story in itself too, Jason. I mean, what a letdown. The police there in that county,
right?
Just were like, 50-year-old case, and it was during COVID, so there was
it's
that.
Like X marks the spot. Go here, and it was just like you can't. What else can we say, right?
Yeah. That's the other thing is we had a map drawn by.
We had a map.
The hitman,
we had a dog that marked it, and by the way, we recorded all this shit so you could actually hear it happening, like we were reporting on it.
It's just how frustrating.
But I'll never forget it. I will never forget. And Tracy talked about just and I'll get into this, like these dogs, the power of scent and smell. It's a superpower for these dogs. Like, so I decided to, instead of diving right into the scandal, the case that I'm going to get into, I wanted to step back and just talk a little bit about cadaver dogs and just dogs in general. And so I started at the AKC website, American Kennel Club, and they described how dogs have a superpower in their noses, like I said, and they have roughly 200 to 300 million receptors in their noses. And that compares to about 6 million in our noses, right? Like they have super senses. And the scent regions are about 40 times that of humans. So this is completely differently wired than what we are. And so this practice of using these dogs for solving crimes and locating bodies and things like that is actually not that old. I discovered that the practice of using a body in modern terms, of course, right? So the practice of what they described of using a body dog back then was first developed by a New York State trooper who was a bloodhound handler and tested the concept on a yellow lab. And this surprised me too. Remember when we spoke about the wood chipper murders in a recent episode? I can't believe that this is it's actually an incredible connection. So when the Connecticut flight attendant Helen Craft had vanished, if you recall, there was a snowplow driver who had seen a wood chipper by a river. Well, it was actually a dog named Lady that investigators had find segments or fragments of human tissue that led them to find that it was actually Helen Craft's body, and ultimately resulted in the murder conviction of her husband. And so this was the first time in Connecticut history that a homicide case was prosecuted without a complete corpse. So I can't believe that. I didn't really even talk about that part of the case that much, but here I am on the AKC's website, and they bring up, and I found this in another research paper about Helen Craft, and this the wood chipper case actually has direct ties to essentially a cadaver dog. That's wild to me.
Yeah, I mean they get used, I think, more often than the average person might realize. And I don't know what the success rate is, percentage wise, but I mean they do get used. I know Tracy. You talk about Tracy Sargent. She's always busy.
Oh,
which is like, I guess, a good and a bad thing. But I mean, she's always going somewhere.
And she's got the gear on. She looks like she's part of a military SWAT team.
She looks like a SWAT team, yeah.
Yeah, it's really awesome. So, so why are dogs so effective here? So the AKC describes the following traits. Dogs have unlike humans, they have no preconceived notions of a field, of a forest, of a plot of land and what's there or not. Like, we're not led to go one way or another, like humans are. Like, I think it's this way, like my gut instinct, or it's got to be under the shady tree. They go where the scent is. They could pick up a death from a few minutes ago or for many, many years later. Like it could be a bones or a body or flesh or remnants from 20, 30 years ago, right? Like that's what we were dealing with in the red clay, and the body of this woman. Like the scent you would think would have died out, years and years ago. But it didn't take much for these dogs.
Well, no, but that was another thing I learned that I thought was incredible science and chemistry. Was, one of the things we learned was if a body was buried near a tree, and as that tree grows, the chemicals from the breaking down of the body leach into and basically are fed into, just like water, as the water is getting sucked up into the tree. So those chemicals actually become part of the tree and the leaves on the tree, and they emit an odor that the dogs can pick up.
And that can be a little confusing for the dogs because it's not like a gravesite or a plot. And so what you reminded me of, that's actually really interesting that you remember that, because it was right near a tree and a root system, and it was near the Mulberry River. And what we devised was the fact that the Mulberry River had flooded often, and a lot of that soot and the dirt and the clay had actually washed in and out over years. And so the only remnants that you might find might be in the root system of this tree that was still standing the whole time, and that's where the dog was actually marking.
Yeah, and that's, even though you have a dog mark a spot, it's not like X marks the spot necessarily, which is, let's make a, whatever it was, 50-yard circle around that area, and it could be anything, but you certainly have a better starting point than where do we go?
A map. Which helps, right? That's better than no map. So the other thing that also is an advantage for dogs, obviously, a dog is of this skill set, because they do need to get trained, is temperament. So they need to be driven. They're a little pushy. They will go on for hours and hours if need be. Like they don't have any exhaustion. They're so obsessed with this task that they're not going to stop unless they finish, hopefully. So like there's a kind of an obsessive quality to them too, right? So I found this great paper by Professor Samantha Peak. She published a study called Understanding Cadaver Dogs in 2023 at San Jose State University. And here's what she found. When a dog inhales, 12 to 13% of the air goes into the olfactory system and the rest goes to the lungs. So it's going right into those senses. The olfactory bulb right under the frontal lobes of the brain is, like I described earlier, is 40 times the size of humans, as we discussed. And there are a bundle of nerve fibers that connect with receptor cells. And this one's really interesting. When a scent is received, for example, in the right nostril, it sends a signal that flows directly to the right side of the brain. And same with the left. And they don't mix. So it's like this direct pipeline from the dog's nostrils, right into this part of the brain connected, and it doesn't get confused. So it's this wow.
Yeah. I was reading that or watching something on Netflix or somewhere that was about dogs, and it was talking about their nose, and that they can actually separate smells.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like if I smelled, I don't know what an example is, but if they smell something that is like a bunch of things mixed together,
a dirty diaper, right?
They can smell the actual diaper fibers. They can smell what's in the diaper. They can smell, if there's urine, for example. They can each independently, and they can pick out it, which is wild. So if they know they're looking for one particular scent, even though it's blended in with all these other things, a dog can pick that out, and that's so fascinating to me.
Yeah, it really is a superpower. Yeah. But it's not good enough just to have these receptors and having the sense of smell. You actually have to train these dogs as puppies, and you can't just set them out in the field. They're going to find a body that's buried, right? So they have to be trained at a lot of things. They have to be used to other animals. They have to be able to adapt with new people and outside stimulants. They have to remain calm and focused. They can't be nervous or afraid. Like I said before, they have to be able to work long hours. They need to be intelligent, of course. They can pick up things quickly. And they have to perform off-leash, which we saw with Tracy's dogs, right? Like, you're not leading them with the leash like the bloodhounds, looking for the fugitive. It's like you kind of let them go in this case, and they've got to find those spots. So they go through stages of training where they get a generalized familiarity. They get generally familiar to the scent. Then they detect a scent that is not fresh later on. So like you here's something that's fresh, and you're going to be able to ID it. And then later on, it's like, I'm going to do something that's been there a while and see if they can pick up that scent. And then you actually have to give them decoy scents. So, kind of try to trick them a little bit and, lead them off the trail. And can they just, like you said, distinguish between certain scents, decoy or other, and see if they can kind of get around that. So pretty fascinating,
Yeah.
She did say, Professor Peak said, there's a question whether are handlers kind of leading these dogs on and kind of influencing them. But she said, she indicated that that these dogs were not being driven by handlers in confusing circumstances or like with multiple scents. The dogs still performed really well. So they did a battery of tests without the handlers influencing it, and they said, no, the dogs are actually able to perform.
Yeah.
Okay. So we've got the background of cadaver dogs, a little bit of our story. And so I discovered this story of a woman named Sandra Anderson and her Doberman mix named Eagle. So as you could probably imagine, something bad is going to happen here. But before I get to that, I found some mentions of Anderson and Eagle in archival newspapers from the early 2000s, before the bad stuff happens, right? including one where they both arrived by plane into the Tampa Bay area, where Eagle sniffed out bone fragments in a field west of Brookville, Florida, that could be the remains of a little girl who had disappeared earlier. This woman, Sandra Anderson, said she had worked on over 1,000 cases for the FBI and police across the country, kind of like Tracy, right? Like you go where the cases are, kind of like Dorothy Allison, the psychic. Wherever we need you, you're going to go. And so she would find, look for bones of people that may have been murdered and, tossed in a field somewhere. She would also be hired to find bones in mass grave sites, including those in Bosnia and Panama. And she even helped with remains of the World Trade Center after the 9/11 attacks. So pretty big stuff, right? And then I found a story from 2003 of a search in Michigan where Anderson and her dog Eagle found bone fragments of, she said, of Charita Thomas, who had disappeared 22 years earlier. Now, on the third day of their search, Anderson insisted going back down to a creek where the site investigators had been looking. They had been kind of combing through mud and soot near the creek, and they just didn't find anything. Like the dogs hadn't really marked anything. And, they're kind of like, there's nothing here. Like it's a dead end. And so she's like, no, we need to go back down to the creek. And they followed her. And she, quote, crouched near the water, and she put one hand behind her foot, and she said, check my foot. And the investigator reached his hand, like kind of down by the muddy water, and the investigator reached his hands in the muddy water, the same water he had been searching for previously, found nothing, and he pulled up a hard nugget. And it was a knuckle bone. And he's like, this is not possible. So the investigator thought there was no way that he had missed this. No way. How could this have happened? And the lab tech that was also working with the investigators showed the investigator a 2-inch piece of carpet she had also pulled. So the investigator and the lab tech, they started to believe that she had planted the evidence. And the technician actually accused her of pulling the bone out of her boot and throwing it in that muddy kind of mess. And they were serious. And a federal indictment came down. It was filed in Detroit, charging her with planting evidence at 3 crime scenes in Michigan in 2003. Now, for a variety of reasons, I talked about there being, thousands of cases that she's worked on, right?
Yeah. Well, not to interrupt you, but where would she have gotten the knuckle bone from this victim? Or was it just some random knuckle bone? Like, why would you do that if they were going to do testing and find out that it wasn't from the victim?
It wasn't from the victim.
Doesn't make any sense to me. Why would you do that?
Because they believed her so much.
Right. So that must be from the victim.
Right. We found a knuckle. It has to be it. Here's a 2-inch piece of carpet. It has to be it. But she did some things I'll get into later on with a specific case where she really, no pun intended, muddies the water. So, but think about that. Like, you've indicted this woman on 3 crime scenes, and she's claimed to have helped so many other cases.
Right.
They now had to look at 50 cases, the FBI did, that Anderson and her dog Eagle have been involved in, right? 3 murder convictions, including a Plymouth doctor who was sentenced to life for butchering his wife. They had to look at that again.
Right.
And just like a whole series of shit. And so they often had put her on the stand at the trials of these cases where they had convicted someone. This is highly problematic. Can't believe this, but she was even on Unsolved Mysteries after helping convict a Michigan biochemist of murdering his wife in 1999. The man, Dr. Azizul Islam, was granted a new trial after he appealed the conviction, basically after this news came out. And his defense claimed that blood on a hacksaw in Islam's basement belonged to Anderson. And it did.
Really?
But other blood and physical evidence found in that same basement matched his wife, Tracy. So, interestingly, in his original trial, the jury had never even heard about the blood on the hacksaw in this original trial.
So he did kill his wife, just not with that hacksaw.
Right. And so the conviction was upheld. So just because she had lied doesn't mean everyone just gets to go free, right?
Right.
And that bone, that knuckle bone, it did not match Cherita Thomas, unfortunately. So the indictment also said that Anderson planted bones in search areas, but used her own body fluids to stain a saw blade, coins, and a piece of cloth. So she was like planting blood and fluids and fibers and like all this crazy stuff in order to claim credit.
How, I just don't, if they, number one, why would they not test that? Whether you trust somebody or not,
Right,
you have for a conviction or to take it to court. And what do they do when they find that it's your blood on it? Like, how do you explain that? It just doesn't make sense.
Yeah, I know. And, it wasn't just murder cases, like I said, but
still.
I mean, they would go to ancient burial sites to make sure they weren't disturbed around new developments. I mean, so like American Indian, indigenous people, you know how sacred those are. And so in central Wisconsin, she would mark it with flags where the dog said, I mean, how do you feel
There's a knuckle bone there. It's always a knuckle bone. She's got a bag of knuckle bones at home.
Bag of knuckle bones, like shark teeth or something.
Yeah.
Like, how can you trust this woman? So Anderson pled guilty to 5 felony charges in March of 2004 and was sentenced to 21 months in prison. Crazy. Is it
just pictured a bag of knuckle bones?
It's just so weird when you like. To me, it's interesting where you can see these prominent people who are in the news for solving cases and like, hey, I'm a dog handler and my dog, I have a cadaver dog and Eagle's a hero, and they're celebrated all over the country in these local newspapers. And then something flips where it's like,
and you watch it come undone.
Yeah, you see like, oh my God, like the police and everyone's so excited, and you were like, oh wow, she's a fraud. It's over. And it's just never talked about again.
Yeah, it's weird. You don't think of someone in that position being wanting to ever, defraud people just because of the nature of what you're doing. You're trying to help victims, you're trying to victims' families or whatever. It's
Can you imagine how problematic that is with like 50 FBI cases, and these are closed, and she's testified, and
people are in prison for life or maybe waiting on death row. I mean, there's any number of scenarios that could...
Any number of scenarios. Yeah. So, yeah, that's the story of, cadaver dogs, how they work, the scams. I mean, everything that we've seen it in real life, and to have it come full circle here in this episode is pretty crazy.
How it all went south.